Thanks so much, Alicia. Hi, this is Sue Osthoff, and I'm with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and we're located in Philadelphia. We're really glad that you all are joining us today. I know some people are still signing on, and I know there's a bunch of people already on, and Alicia asked you to put in your how you identify your profession. It can help our presenter know who's on and help us know who's on, so we really appreciate you doing that. And also, if there's more of you than one person at your site, if you can let us know how many folks are there, that would be really helpful. We really appreciate it, so thanks. So this webinar is actually the 8th in our series of webinars from our project here at the National Clearinghouse on ending mass incarceration, centralizing racial justice, and developing alternatives, the role of the anti-domestic violence and sexual assault programs. And before we go any further, I really want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for the support of both this webinar and the support of what I think is a very important project. We are so happy to have Andrea Ritchie with us today, and she's going to present on Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. I am going to just flip the slide to her very short bio here. And in an effort to save time, I'm going to just do a very brief introduction. You can read what it says there. And you can see from the slide that Andrea has done a lot of really important, interesting, and I think very courageous work over the years, including writing a book about what she'll be talking about today. She's also co-authored with Kimberly Crenshaw the Say Her Name report. But I have to say this short bio and intro hardly begins to say what this amazing attorney, organizer, and author has done over the years. Andrea is a much sought-out speaker and collaborator because she is truly a national thought leader and strategist on policing and the criminalization of women and LGBTQ people of color, and also on policing and gender-based violence. I always learn so much from Andrea each time I get to hear her speak, so I feel like we're really, really lucky to have her with us today. Before I turn it over to her, I just want to note that I'll be collecting questions for Andrea during the presentation. We plan to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions, so if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll collect them, and I'll acknowledge that I see your question. So if I don't acknowledge it, you might want to send it again. And for those of you who have joined via phone only today, you can email your questions to my coworker, Cindine Pizzell, and that's at cindine@ncdbw.org. I'll spell her name at CINDENE at ncdbw.org. Also, I'll mention it now, and Alicia will talk about this a little bit at the end. You'll get a very short evaluation when you sign out of the webinar. It's really helpful to us and to our speakers if you will fill it out, so we hope you will. It will only take a couple of minutes. So, Andrea, thanks so much for your really amazing and important work, and thank you so much for your willingness to share it with us today.
Thank you, Sue, and NCDBW for inviting me to do this webinar, and just for all of your groundbreaking and critical work over the past 3 decades to challenge, interrupt the criminalization of survivors of family and interpersonal violence. I just feel like the Clearinghouse has played such a critical role in shaping my own analysis and really helping to counter the unintended consequences of our reliance on the criminal punishment system to address all forms of harm, which has been the criminalization, prosecution, and incarceration of survivors of violence under a variety of circumstances. And as many of you know, the Clearinghouse's work has focused largely on what happens after survivors are charged with a crime connected to their history of abuse, including providing expert criminal defense and mitigation evidence. And my work has focused on what happens before that point, including understanding the critical role that police play in the process of criminalizing survivors and the ways in which racial profiling and police violence, which are typically thought of as something that primarily affects Black men and men of color, who are understood to be cisgender, who are understood to be heterosexual in the public sphere, how those same phenomena play out in the private realm of police responses to violence in our homes and communities, and really are kind of driving this criminalization of survivors that we tend to hear about on the back end, right? When we hear about Centoya Brown or Brescia Meadows or Marissa Alexander or CC McDonald, we're hearing about the criminalization of survivors kind of after police involvement is somewhat hidden, but it's very much connected to ongoing patterns of racial profiling, police violence, and criminalization in our communities. I did want to say also that in addition to what Sue shared in my introduction, my work is really deeply informed and driven by the work of Insight, a national network of radical feminists of color who have been organizing to end both state and interpersonal violence in our homes and communities, which along with, and one of their co-founders, many of you probably know of, Beth Ritchie, who's the author of Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence in America's Prison Nation, have really worked to illuminate these dangerous intersections between state and interpersonal violence and the ways in which reliance on the criminal punishment system to respond to domestic violence, family violence, community violence has in many ways produced violence against survivors and criminalization of survivors in ways that we really want to interrupt and redress. Before I go any further, I just also want to give a healthy trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about physical and sexual violence. I may sometimes describe or use the words that police officers use to kind of illustrate the dynamics at play. As you saw from my bio, I am a Black lesbian. I am an immigrant. I'm a survivor of both state and interpersonal violence, and all of these things really shape my experience and analysis of these issues, including being mindful of the impact of reproducing violence, of resharing violence, and really trying to balance this desire to make visible some forms of policing and police violence that have been intractably invisible for a long time, but at the same time not sort of reproducing images of Black death violation in ways that sort of fuel dehumanization rather than challenging it. So I don't always get that balance right. I really encourage folks to, after the webinar, if you have feedback on how I might better strike that balance, please provide it. In the meantime, just make sure you take care of yourself during the webinar, and feel free to check out as you need to. I'm also going to try and slow down for our captioner. Apologies. I'm a fast talker from New York. And then there was one other thing I was going to share, but I think I will move forward to sort of highlighting, bringing together two conversations. One has been around sort of, growing awareness of and commitment to responding to interpersonal, domestic, family violence, sexual assault over the past 4 decades, increased visibility, increased awareness, and increased commitment to responding to it. And over that same period of time, a rapid growth in the population of people incarcerated in women's prisons and jails. And most folks by now know that women have been the fastest growing population of people incarcerated in prisons, increasing 700% over the past 4 decades and outpacing the rate of growth in the men's prison population by 50% over that period of time. And that also our focus on prisons has made invisible the fact that the people who are incarcerated in women's jails has increased by twice that amount. The women's jail population has seen a 14-fold increase since 1970. So even if though not as many women might be serving hard time, they may be serving as much time cycling in and out of local jails where conditions, services, supports are even and certainly support upon release are even less than they are for prisons. And as many people may know, that racial disparities and makeup of the incarcerated population in the U.S. has been shifting. Black women are still incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. Many folks may be aware of the commonly known statistic that 1 in 3 Black men will face incarceration in their lifetime. That's been popularized by the new Jim Crow in the film The 13th. Many fewer, and has sort of galvanized a mass movement to end mass incarceration. Many folks maybe don't know the statistic that 1 in 2 Black transgender women report experiencing incarceration in their lifetime, making them the most incarcerated population by that particular statistic. And I would argue that both statistics should be galvanizing movements, and we're particularly mindful of the high rates of incarceration of Black trans women during Pride Month, as we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, which was led in part by Black trans women like Miss Major and Marsha P. Johnson. So in many ways, Stonewall is 50 years later still now. Many of us may also know that many of the folks who are incarcerated in women's jails and prisons are mothers, many of them of minor children. Many of them were the primary caregiver of their minor child before their arrest, and most of them have been accused of minor offenses, which may be related to violence they're experiencing or poverty they're experiencing. As I indicated earlier, LGBT folks, and particularly women, trans, and gender nonconforming people in the queer population, continue to be disproportionately incarcerated. This same study by the Williams Institute indicated that 42% of people in women's jails or women's prisons were queer in some way prior to their incarceration. And, while I would love that to be our representation in the general population, it's not. And so it really is representing that even though we have in many ways advanced exponentially since the days of Stonewall, in other ways we're continuing to experience criminalization, even as laws and policies have changed at very high rates. As many of you may know, there's also high disproportionate incarceration of people with disabilities, and of people in women's jails. Almost half of people incarcerated in women's jails have some form of disability. And in prisons, 31% of people in men's and women's prisons have some form of disability. And many disabilities among people incarcerated in women's prisons and jails are connected to violence and trauma, and are very much exacerbated by experiences of incarceration. So, as documented by this pie by the Prison Policy Institute, a significant portion of the incarcerated population in women's jails and prisons are there on violent offenses. I think we tend to think about the policies and practices driving that rapid growth in the women's jail and prison population over the past 4 decades as being driven largely by the war on drugs. That is true. A third of people incarcerated in women's state prisons are there on drug offenses. We tend to think of it sometimes as being driven by poverty and sort of criminalization of things like what's called welfare fraud, or other ways in which women are attempting to survive economic and other structural exclusions. But the reality is that a third of people are in state prison and in federal prison on violent offenses in women's facilities. And so it means that we need to tackle incarceration based on violent offenses, which carry increasingly harsh penalties and ensnare many survivors. We can't simply focus on non-violent offenses or drug-related offenses or poverty-related offenses. We have to tackle offenses that are deemed violent, including offenses like murder and manslaughter, which, as you'll see, make up a not insignificant portion of that pie for people incarcerated in women's state prisons. And there are statistics that indicate that a significant number of those folks are survivors of violence. In California, of people incarcerated for killing another person, over 90% were previously abused by the person they killed. And in New York, that number is over 60%. And while the majority of people in jails are there on nonviolent offenses, many of us know that there are connections between the drug, property, and public order offenses that lead to incarceration in women's jails, particularly in the absence of the ability to pay bail or bond, that are connected to experiences of interpersonal violence and that aggravate and exacerbate the impacts of interpersonal violence, including child custody and other health connections and access to services and shelter. So many of you may have been familiar with a lot of what I just shared. My work focuses on addressing the patterns and policing practices and patterns of profiling and criminalization that produce these statistics and realities. Because we all know, obviously, when you first meet a client, she doesn't just show up in court one day. She's there as the result, usually, of some interaction with law enforcement. And those interactions with law enforcement literally can change the course of people's lives and are what produce these disparities. And it's important to look at those and to make sure that the ways in which they play out for women, and particularly Black women and women of color, and other criminalized populations of women, is that if we don't address their realities, then we're not going to be able to address not only the needs and concerns of survivors we work with, but we're also not going to be able to address the crisis of mass incarceration. So as this graph shows, over the past 10 years, we've started to have an impact on the population of folks incarcerated in men's prisons. It started to go down thanks to much of the reform that we've been engaged in, much of the attention that the statistic of 1 in 3 Black men being incarcerated has generated, and energy that has activism and reform and legislation and policy change that has started to lead to a decrease in the population of men incarcerated. But the population of women incarcerated continues to rise. And in fact, in many states, much of the progress that's been made in decreasing incarceration in men's prison has been completely counteracted and in fact exceeded by increased incarceration in women's prisons. So we need to look at those policing practices, policing policies, prosecution practices, obviously, and also the practices inside women's prisons facilities, disciplinary practices that often are not sensitive to the impacts of trauma, to the ways in which women react to trauma, particularly when it's being exacerbated by incarceration, that actually produce increased discipline and increased policing inside prisons instead of support, which then extend their sentences and lead and continue to drive up the numbers of folks incarcerated in women's prisons. And criminalization and policing of survivors and other women and queer and trans people not only contributes to incarceration, it also contributes to this epidemic of police violence that has driven, again, mass movements across the country over the last few years. One of the things that consistently over the past 2 decades of documenting police violence, including police killings, through the lens of the experiences of Black women and women of color, that I've observed every time to my shock, dismay, and grief, is that many of these killings happen in the context of police officers responding to domestic violence calls, and particularly to calls for assistance. And that it's connected to a recent statistic that came out of the University of Washington in St. Louis that found that Black women are the group that are most likely to be killed by police when they're unarmed, of any group, including Black men, men of color, any other demographic group. And they talk about how Black women in particular are more likely to be perceived as a threat by police officers no matter what they're doing, no matter whether they're armed or not, no matter how old they are, no matter how young they are, no matter how vulnerable they are. And we've seen that in countless sort of conversations and police videos, and where, Black women are being targeted by police for napping while Black, standing while Black, using the pool while Black, mothering a child, breastfeeding while Black. And one instance really stood out to me was the sort of golfing while Black incident in at a golf course in York, Pennsylvania, where the dispatcher was asked, what danger do these Black women who the police were called on, one of whom was the head of the local NAACP or involved in local NAACP, what's the danger? Is she armed? And the response was only with her mouth. And that there really is this notion that Black women present a threat merely, as we all saw in the Sandra Bland video as well, by merely speaking out in their own defense, by protesting injustice, by protesting mistreatment, by speaking out against violence that's being done to them, whether it's by police officers, a community member, or an intimate partner or family member. And that's what contributes to deaths of people in the context of domestic violence calls, like Ora Rosser, who was killed within seconds of a police officer opening the door at a domestic violence call, because he perceived her to be a threat, even though what she had in her hand was a cooking knife that she was making dinner in the middle of making dinner. Or what led Janisha Fonville, a black lesbian from Charlotte, North Carolina, to be killed by police, again, within seconds of them entering the home at the request of her girlfriend in a domestic violence call, because she got up from the couch when the police came in, which any of us might do. Lying on the couch, you would get up, and immediately that was perceived as not only a threatening act, but an act that required a response of deadly force by police. So when we're thinking about police violence and where it's taking place and who it's targeting, we need to think not only of when it's happening in public spaces, but also when it's happening in private spaces in the context of police responses to domestic violence, and how that's shaped by police perceptions of Black women and women of color. And I write in the book, you'll see that I write about police responses to Black women, Indigenous women, and other women of color, immigrant women, and so forth. I'm focusing primarily in this talk on police responses to Black women, mostly because that's the communities I'm from and organize in, but many of the things I'm saying apply with equal force to other women of color. And they also apply in the context of police responses not only to domestic and family violence, but to homophobic and transphobic violence. So for instance, Kiwi Herring is a Black trans woman who was experiencing a long pattern of transphobic and homophobic violence from her downstairs neighbor. The morning she was killed, police were called because her neighbor had set fire to her porch and she had responded. And but when the police showed up, the person who was shot dead immediately was Kiwi Herring, who was the person who was experiencing the violence, the survivor, and not the person who was committing it. So those are just some examples of how criminalization not only leads to incarceration, but intersects with this larger conversation about policing and police violence that we're having right now. And in order to understand how policing and law enforcement and criminalization contribute to these high rates of incarceration and police violence against survivors, I really ask folks to think about and sort of step back and just think about the process of criminalization itself. It's a process that we all tend to normalize quite a bit. We assume that, sure, there might be some criminal laws that are unjust or archaic or discriminatorily enforced, but, you know, there are some things that we all agree, you know, should be punished by the state, that people should be, you know, held accountable for and perhaps separated from society and incarcerated for. But if we think about it, the fact is even some things that we might all agree are subjects of some kind of response from the state, such as killing another human being, in fact, aren't universally criminalized, right? If it's done through a drone strike against a person in Yemen, it might not even be considered murder or be considered, you know, an act of national security or patriotism. If it's so often we see if the killing is committed by a police officer, it will be deemed justified and not a crime. If it's done in self-defense, it really kind of depends who's defending themselves and against who, whether the state's going to criminalize it. So even for the things that might at first blush seem sort of standard and kind of non-negotiable objective bases for criminalization, it turns out that in fact the process of criminalization is really a political one, and it's one that's sort of a decision about which conduct is going to be punished by the state, by who and when, and that shifts over time, but also in some ways pretty reliably happens in a way that is not necessarily about deeming which acts are criminalized, but which populations are criminalized. So often criminalization is a process of determining that an entire population of people are deemed criminal through criminalizing narratives that really then end up informing the enforcement of all laws. So we're seeing, for instance, in this current moment, a lot of conversation about migrants being inherently criminal, being inherently rapist, inherently violent, inherently engaged in criminalized economies. And that then shapes how individual migrants are policed and what interactions look like with state institutions. And that's a process that we've seen over time with Black people, with Indigenous people, with queer and trans people, with homeless people, such that really laws might change and shift over time, but the same stories are told about those populations such that they're often criminalized by whatever laws exist in place. So this octopus is sort of trying to illustrate the fact that criminalization happens through laws and policies, but it also happens through stories that are told about people. So for instance, there have been stories told about Black mothers since slavery that Black mothers are bad mothers. It was a story told to cover up the fact that Black mothers were experiencing high rates of infant mortality because of the conditions under which they were living, laboring, giving birth, and raising children. And rather than address the conditions, the story became that Black mothers are bad mothers, and there's high rates of infant mortality. And it was also a story used to justify separating Black mothers from their children for slavers' profit. And those stories, even though those conditions have changed, those stories continue over time. They might sort of shift and inform. They might take the form of welfare queen. They might take the form of another story about Black mothers, but it informs how laws are enforced. And it might inform, for instance, how a feticide law is enforced against a Black pregnant person. It might inform how child welfare laws are enforced. It might inform how public order laws are enforced. So that's what this octopus is sort of trying to illustrate, and that all this is taking place sort of in a sea of various ideologies that this octopus of criminalization and the stories it relies on are serving. And that it's also important for us to think about the fact that criminalization is also happening through a number of institutions at any given time. I think we often need to sort of recognize the fact that criminalization at this point has become our society's default response to every harm, every need, every conflict, and that it has infected almost every aspect of our life and every institution that we are involved in, and it is used to advance certain political agendas. It's the primary tool to advance certain political agendas. So it requires us to look at how criminalization is happening not only through the institutions that we might think about, like police or probation or traffic enforcement or parole, but that it's also happening through what we might consider helping institutions like shelters, social services, ones that we might even be involved in, whether it's through direct police presence in those institutions or the ways in which rules in those institutions are enforced that might bring the police, bring the criminal punishment system into those institutions. And that criminalization is also happening along the axes of a number of different identities, again, ones that we might normally think of, like race or having a prior criminal record or immigration status, but also ones that we might not think about, like sexuality or gender identity or being a survivor of violence might actually be a way in which you would be driven into a web of criminalization. And so if we think about it sort of through these larger frames, I think it helps us better understand how the criminalization, particularly of survivors, that takes place, how police perceive survivors when they first come in contact with them, and how survivors are coming into contact with the criminal legal system in such a way that's producing the numbers and statistics I was sharing earlier. It's important for us to think about the fact that this process starts very early, that it's one of the institutions that police are very much present in, and that criminalization has increasingly infected or been influenced, is the public education system. These are statistics from the National Black Women's Justice Initiative, looking at sort of how Black girls are represented, grossly overrepresented in the number of girls arrested in schools and referred to law enforcement. And again, this is sort of, we need to connect this to being a survivor of violence, that often Black girls are criminalized, arrested for, again, speaking up for themselves, defending themselves, asking or insisting on being treated with dignity by adults at their school, and that many or defending themselves from violence they're experiencing, sexual, physical, bullying, violence. This is particularly true for trans and LGBT girls in schools, and that often the girls who are being criminalized are also survivors of other forms of violence. So many folks might be familiar with the dreadful image of the assault at Spring Valley High, where a 15-year-old girl was forcibly removed from her classroom by a school resource officer, and that the initiating incident of that was that a teacher had asked her to put away her phone, and she hadn't done so quickly enough to his liking, and that's why he called the police officer into the room. What many folks don't know is that she was a survivor of violence. She had just been placed into foster care, And who knows why she had her phone out, but that these things are connected, and that, girls' experiences of violence in the home and in communities are being criminalized through their behavior or their reactions or their responses at school. We also tend not to think about how criminalization is of women of color plays out in sort of our common conversations about policing in the streets. Just quick statistics showing that racial disparities in New York City, in the stops that were the subject of great conversation for a number of years, the rates of racial disparity are identical among stops of women as they are among stops of men. And that these stops, similarly in Chicago, young Black women are second to young Black men in terms of the percentage of them who report a stop in the previous year. And actually, young Black women report more car stops than young Black men. And that these stops themselves have an element of violence to them, of humiliation, of degradation. The person in this article described, for instance, doing a double shift at the hospital, being stopped on her way home by police officers who, then proceeded to dump her bag out onto the street. And, she just done a double shift. So there was an extra pair of underwear, maybe extra bra, there was birth control, there was tampons, there was, all kinds of things that they sort of picked up and held up for everyone to see and, ridiculed her about and then left her there. And in terms of, safety, what does that signal in terms of her safety from that moment forward? The police have just not only signaled to everyone around her that she's proper subject for ridicule and targeting and violation, but they also aren't going to protect her. And so there's a way in which, the criminalization that happens even through street stops or stop and frisk can increase vulnerability to community and interpersonal violence. Another consequence of criminalization that we really don't talk about enough, in my opinion, and particularly in the current moment where we're in the middle of a national conversation about an epidemic of sexual violence in this country, is that one of the consequences of criminalization is once you've deemed a group of people criminal, you can do anything to them. You can put them in a cage. You can put them in a concentration camp at the border. You can separate them from their children. You can put their children in a concentration camp. You can put them in solitary confinement for 40 years. You can subject them to daily strip searches as they move about a correctional facility. You can tase them. You can do any number of things. And that one of the things that happens when a population is criminalized is that sexual assault and sexual violence against them becomes largely invisible. And so while we've been having this national conversation about sexual violence, we have not talked about sexual violence perpetrated by law enforcement agents or in prisons. And I would argue that law enforcement agents and correctional officials certainly have at least as much power as Harvey Weinstein did over a much larger group of people, and certainly if not more. And so, and they exercise it in many instances in the same way. And so we really need to, as we argue in this policy brief from the National Black Women's Justice Initiative and the Ms. Foundation, expand the way in which we think about and talk about sexual violence and include sexual violence against criminalized populations in our analysis. So just taking a brief detour on that topic, sexual violence by law enforcement officers is the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct after excessive force. It's certainly not the second most frequently talked about. There's some research that indicates that an officer is caught in an act of sexual misconduct every 5 days. That's based on data over a 10-year period. And those are just the ones who are caught. Researchers across the spectrum, including many who are current and former law enforcement officers, will tell you that the folks who are caught just represent the tip of the iceberg, and that really, in the words of former Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper, sexual assault by law enforcement officers is law enforcement's dirty little secret. And what's important to know about that is that officers, again, target people who, as most people who perpetrate sexual assault do, target people who are vulnerable and who they think will not be believed when they come forward. And again, an alarming aspect of my research and other people's research around sexual violence by law enforcement is that one of their primary targets are survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. This is documented by the every 5 days study I cited earlier, which was done by the Buffalo News, and also by a series that the Philadelphia Inquirer did in 2006, where they particularly focused on how police target survivors of violence for sexual assault, and quoted several officers sort of talking about the logic behind this. And one officer said, well, of course, I'm going to show up. I'm going to be her knight in shining armor. I'm going to rescue her from this bad dude. Of course, I'm going to ask for a date. It's almost a quid pro quo, right? Another officer said, what do you mean, getting dates from domestic violence survivors? I mean, it's so easy. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. Literally, those were his words. So this is a pattern of policing and police violence of survivors that many of us are probably aware of if we're working with survivors, but that's not part of our larger conversation about criminalization of survivors of violence and what forms that takes sometimes. So again, it happens in terms of common contexts, police responses to calls for help, including domestic violence calls. So some of you may have heard of Tiawanda Moore. She was a Black survivor. She is a Black woman living in Chicago, called the police because her boyfriend was beating her, and the officers responded, followed the protocol that we've all advocated for, right? Separate the two, the abuser and the survivor, take down their version of events, except the officer who took her to a private place, instead of doing that, sexually assaulted her, asked for her number, asked for a date. And when she went to report it to Internal Affairs, they actively discouraged her from pursuing a complaint and, you know, sort of mentioned the fact that they knew that at one time she had been a stripper at a club and that no one would believe her. And said, you know, if she ever wanted the police to respond to her call for help again, she would not pursue this complaint. And she, you know, the part where it gets unusual is that she was, you know, appalled by them saying this and recorded them saying this. And at the time, Illinois had a law that said that if you're going to record a conversation, you had to have the consent of both parties. So when the police found out she had recorded the conversation, she was charged with illegal wiretapping, which is a felony, which carries a 15-year sentence. And she was tried on that charge for 2 years and ultimately, hopefully, finally acquitted. Well, of course, nothing happened to the officer who she had accused of sexually assaulting her. So the clear message in that case and in many other cases, some of you may be following the case of Anna Chambers in New York, is that when survivors do come forward, they're further criminalized as they, you know, file their complaint of police sexual misconduct and targeted. And so the message is, you know, you're going to be the one on trial, not the cop who sexually assaulted you, so don't bother. And in terms of, as we start to shift to thinking about policies we might want to address as people working with survivors and concerned about the consequences of criminalization on survivors, a research I did in 2014 found that the majority of police departments in the United States, in the sort of top 35 by size, 52% had no policy specifically telling police officers that sexual harassment, assault, asking domestic violence survivors for dates, you know, targeting young women in schools they were policing, that sort of thing was against department policy, and most departments didn't outline any kind of disciplinary procedures or prevention procedures for that kind of behavior. So that's something that advocates could be focusing on in terms of policing practices that affect criminalized survivors. So going back to sort of this process of criminalization, you know, assuming that it ends in an arrest, first of all, that's happening in the context of an overall growth in arrests of women over the past 3 decades that sort of went from, in 1980, there was 1 million arrests of women. 20 years later, it's almost tripled in terms of annual arrests of women at about 2.5 million arrests per year. If we're looking at the top charges, you'll see on this graph that the top charge, the purple line, is all other offenses. Generally speaking, those all other offenses tend to be violation of conditions of parole or probation or of electronic monitoring, because what many of you may also know is that the majority of women under the control of the criminal legal system are not, in fact, in cells in institutions, but are on probation and parole. and under the supervision of parole and probation officers who, by the way, also abuse their power on a regular basis in terms of extracting or forcing sexual conduct. But that's why one of the top charges for women is then violating those conditions. Many of you working with survivors may know those conditions are often impossible to follow, contradictory. Same is true for conditions of electronic monitoring. You may be under house arrest and unable to leave your home with an ankle bracelet on. You may get a call from your child's school telling you your child is sick and throwing up and has to be taken home immediately. They can't keep the child there. No one else is there to pick her up. You're in a bind. You leave the house to get your child, you're going to violate parole. You leave your child at school, you may open a child welfare case, right? So that kind of condition is something that many survivors, or you may be under conditions of parole, and the conditions of abuse in your home may force you to violate the conditions of parole, and that's how you wind up in that sort of top charge. But you'll see, if we take out that top charge, that in the top 5 charges that lead to arrests of women is assault or aggravated assault. And that's pretty consistent over time, over the past 5 years, but also just generally speaking over time. And these are, I see many of you here on the chat are from New York, so you'll see the top 10 arrest charges for women in 2014, which I think were the most recent stats available at the time this report was written. And you'll see that simple assault is the top charge, and while aggravated assault is at the bottom, it's still, registering in the top 10 arrest charge categories. And so not only does this tell us that addressing incarceration of women it requires us to deal not just with nonviolent or drug-related offenses, it tells us that it also requires us really to look at what is driving arrests and criminalization of women for assault. And with that, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to...
Hey, Andrea, sorry to interrupt, but we have a captioner.
Yes.
So just remember,
yes,
slow it down a little bit.
I know. I apologize, and my apologies to the captioner. I keep trying to slow myself down, and then, I'm clearly passionate about these issues, so I speed up as a result. And I'm hoping that the slides in some ways make up for the speed at which I'm speaking. So one of the ways the research sort of is showing what's driving that high rate of assault charges is mandatory arrest policies, which many of us as DV advocates may have advocated for. But in fact, some of the studies show that particularly at the beginning of the period that mandatory arrest policies were in place, that they were really driving the number of women arrested for assault charges in domestic violence situations. I'm sure many of you know what causes that. Either by the time the police show up, the guy isn't there, or a woman might have defended herself. The guy might have scratched himself and said that the woman did it, or might be the only person in the family who speaks English, or may disclose a trans woman's gender identity and or mental health issues, or etc., immigration status, any number of things that lead the police to then focus their attention on the survivor instead of on the person who committed the violence. And obviously, racial profiling, as I described earlier, doesn't just happen in the context of schools or stops or stop and frisk. It also happens when police respond to a home, and they may assume that, because a person is Black, more masculine appearing, and a migrant, is angry about what happened to them, is speaking up about what happened to them, that may also lead officers to profile them as the person who committed the violence. And that was showed by a study conducted by the Urban Justice Center that showed that 66% of survivors arrested pursuant to mandatory arrest policies were Black or Latina, and 43% were living below the poverty line. And this piece about particularly mandatory arrests driving arrests of LGBTQ survivors of interpersonal violence, which could be contributing to that massive disproportion in incarceration of LGBTQ people, is something that obviously has been going on for some time and continues to increase at a fairly high rate, according to statistics by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs. So we really need to pay attention to how the policies that we're pushing in terms of getting society to respond more quickly to domestic violence, interpersonal violence, to do so in a way that increases, that is supposed to increase safety for the survivor. In fact, because when the police respond to violence in the home, they're acting on those same criminalizing narratives, they're engaging in the similar racial profiling practices, that they might actually end up producing higher rates of arrest for assault of survivors than we had hoped. So one study I just really want to point people to, unfortunately I don't have it up on a slide, but we'll be sure to drop it in the chat box, is one conducted by City University of Law professor Julie Goldscheid and colleagues. They surveyed, maybe many of you who are on the call, in 2015, they surveyed more than 900 anti-violence advocates, survivors, and other stakeholders from all 50 states, and found similar patterns of profiling and discriminatory arrest and failure to protect by police officers. So I'm just going to read a few quotes from the study. One was from providers talking about the fact that they believe that police thought violence is part of an impoverished or quote unquote ghetto lifestyle, and that's why they would not necessarily, why, for instance, 43% of people living below the poverty line, why that statistic would exist among people arrested under, of survivors arrested, is because there's this notion that, you're not a survivor, this is just how you roll when you are from a certain economic class, and therefore survivors are profiled as perpetrators in those situations. Another service provider said, my African-American clients seem to be treated worse by police. Police are more likely to suspect them of contributing to the violence or in some other way being at fault for what's happened. Police also often assume that if the victim is Native American, that she has been drinking and thus caused the problem. Victims of Latinx descent are often assumed to be lying about a crime to qualify for immigration remedies, even if they're a U.S. citizen. And lastly, the assumption is that Muslim women, South Asian, Arab, and Middle Eastern women aren't deserving of police protection because of the problematic assumptions that equate Muslim women with being inherently oppressed because of their religious identity or connecting them to terrorism. And so, additionally, there's a lot of research, as I said, from the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs and other LGBT organizations that talk about how trans, queer, and gender nonconforming people, lesbians, bisexual women, are criminalized by law enforcement officers who are responding, either because they're blaming, for instance, trans women for violence they experience by saying it's because of their gender identity, that they will walk into a situation with two women and just be like, oh my God, this is a cat fight, we're just arresting everybody, or not understanding something to be domestic violence between two men and just thinking that there's just a fight and they're just going to arrest everybody. So, so these are some of the sort of ways in which profiling intersects with mandatory arrest policies to produce these kinds of statistics. Also, one phenomenon that particularly Francine Sherman highlights at University of Boston is that, we enacted mandatory arrest policies with adult interpersonal violence in mind between people in some kind of family relationship. And increasingly, mandatory arrest policies are being used in response to family violence between adults and children. And that this actually is becoming an increasing pathway to arrests of girls for assault when they're either defending themselves against violence by someone in their home, their parent or caregiver, or maybe engaged in some kind of conflict with them, and that ends up driving arrests of young women for assault in the home. And that again takes place in racially disparate ways, involves profiling Black and Native youth who may be survivors as violence for arrest for assault at rates 2 to 4 times greater than white youth. And that these kinds of charges, can lead not only to arrest and criminalization, but to incarceration. So I didn't show juvenile arrest data or incarceration data, but the charge for young women is also often assault, and that there are similar sort of proportions of young women in juvenile facilities for assault. And Sarah, I do see your question about misarrest. Generally, misarrest is arresting a survivor. So arresting someone who is in a relationship or in a situation where they are the target of violence, and that they are erroneously arrested as someone who perpetrated the violence. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes, okay. So this criminalization of young girls, particularly in the context of family violence, can really, again, have deadly consequences. So Jenai Macmillan was a 16-year-old girl who experienced a great deal of violence in her home at the hands of her mother. In fact, she was taken out of her mother's home and placed in foster care as a result, and was sort of, as we should be trying to do, was in a situation where there was an attempt at reunification supported by family services, et cetera, during which her mother became abusive and physically assaulted her, and then called the police and claimed that Jenai assaulted her instead. The police showed up and arrested Jenai. And Jenai then was taken to a detention facility, a juvenile detention facility in Kentucky, where 24 hours later she died. So again, I just really want to emphasize that it's a continuum, that this process of criminalization can lead to stops, can lead to violence by police officers, including sexual violence. It can lead to incarceration, but also it can have deadly consequences that we need to be careful and attuned to. And even when they're not deadly, as I said, it can lead to physical violence. So this is an image of Lashawn White, who is a deaf survivor of violence who called the police because she was being choked by a woman in her home. And she clearly explained multiple times to the dispatcher that she required an interpreter to communicate with hearing people, that the police should arrive with an interpreter, that she was deaf, that she required an interpreter, that, just repeatedly emphasized that. The dispatcher told her when the police arrived that she should go to the door and meet them. As soon as she stepped outside, the police tased her, threw her to the ground, and arrested her. And even though her neighbors were yelling at them that she couldn't understand their commands and that she was deaf, and ended up spending a weekend locked up with no interpreter to help her explain her situation or get out, as well with injuries from having fallen to the ground after being tased and being hit by the police. So, and this is a situation where the police showed up, and this would be a classic case of misarrest, for instance, Sarah, where the police showed up and just decided who the survivor was and who the abuser was based on whatever kind of racial profiling they were engaged in, which includes profiling people with disabilities, and not adequately ensuring communication that would have clarified the situation. So all that to say that we need to be paying attention to all the ways that survivors are criminalized, and all the ways in which policing practices and policies, including mandatory and pro-arrest policies, are contributing to that, particularly as they're taking place or being enforced or enacted within this larger context of criminalization of racial, gender, and sexual profiling by responding officers. So this really pushes us to really rethink how we rely on police to respond to domestic violence and other forms of interpersonal and community violence, that really requires us to connect the patterns of policing we're seeing in communities to the patterns of policing we see in anti-violence responses, and to really maybe start to question whether some of the policies that we put forward thinking that they would be helpful to survivors are instead contributing to the criminalization of survivors and violence that they're experiencing. And then, of course, there are cases of severe and deadly violence that lead to criminalization of survivors. For instance, when they shoot someone in self-defense or shoot an abuser or kill an abuser in some other way. And yet we still need to really recognize the role that police play in framing those cases, even though obviously we might be focusing on a prosecutor or on a judge or on a jury in terms of our advocacy efforts. Some of you may have seen the story that broke yesterday about a pregnant woman in Alabama who was in a dispute with someone, not a domestic violence necessarily incident, but was in a dispute with someone and the pregnant woman wound up being shot in the stomach. The person who shot her was not charged with any offense. She now, 5 months later, has been charged with manslaughter because she was pregnant and as a result of the shooting lost the pregnancy. And if you read the article, it's really clear that the police are the ones shaping that story and producing that charge. They are describing her as somehow the person who is responsible for being shot and therefore responsible for the loss of her own pregnancy, and that her actions as a Black woman were what contributed to her experiencing violence. So very similar to the quote I was reading earlier from the service provider who was talking about how Black survivors of domestic violence are perceived. Here's a survivor of gun violence who's being perceived and framed in the same way by police, and that is something that happens quite often. So if we think about cases like Marissa Alexander's, many of you are familiar with her. She was a survivor of domestic violence who responded to violence by her abuser one day by firing a warning shot from a gun that she had that was licensed in the state of Florida that had a stand your ground law. She was in her own home. She fired a warning shot into the ceiling. No one was hurt. And yet she was prosecuted and sentenced to 20 years in prison until an advocacy campaign ended up reducing that sentence. But what I think those of us who are concerned about criminalization of survivors need to think about in cases like hers is what could have gone differently even before she got to the prosecutor's office. What could the police have done differently? They could have responded to her house. They could have been like, wow, okay, we see there's a long list of history of calls to this house. We see that this person has been accused of domestic violence very often. We're so glad to see that you and the kids are okay. We completely understand that in this circumstance, it makes absolute sense that you would be standing your ground. We see no one was hurt. We see your gun is registered. Is there anything else we can do to help you be safe today, Miss Alexander? No, thank you, goodbye. That could have been the end of the incident. And so it's really important for those of us who are engaged in this work to start thinking backwards, back to that point of the process and to the point where the octopus is working to try and interrupt some of those tentacles. Many of you may have heard of CC McDonald, who's, I think, speaking tonight at a Pride event in New York City, thankfully. She's now free, but she was attacked and her face was cut by a broken glass by a white supremacist as she was walking down a street in Minneapolis. She responded, thought her life was in danger, responded in a way that resulted in the death of her attacker. Again, the police could have responded and been like, wow, we completely understand how terrified you must have been in that moment. And of course, self-defense is an option in this situation, and could have written up the police reports and framed the case to the prosecutor in a way that was completely different, that said, we understand that Black trans women experience exponential rates of violence. Of course, the fact that, a Black trans woman is killed by someone in the community almost every month these days must have been running through your head. Of course, you must have been terrified. We completely understand your actions. But again, that's not how it happened. And then she spent some time in prison defending herself. The last example I'll give is of Kai Peterson, who's a Black trans man who was raped in Georgia and defended himself, as we tell people to do, right? I mean, I feel like we penalize rape survivors if they don't fight back, and then we penalize them when they do. And so Kai Peterson did fight back. His assailant was killed. And as a Black trans man, he knew he wouldn't be believed, and so attempted to conceal what happened. When the police caught up with him, they literally said, even though he went through a rape kit and all kind of evidence pointed to the fact that he had been sexually assaulted, they literally said to Kai, you don't look like a rape victim to us. And that shaped the entire course of the case, such that he's now doing 20 years in prison, having acted in self-defense in the way that we expect rape survivors to. So we just really would urge us to really think about the role that police play in criminalization of survivors. When we're defending these cases, we do need to intervene at the court level in the ways that the clearinghouse and other folks are doing, but to the extent that the folks on this call are also engaged in or have the ability to influence policing practices, the ways that policing happens in society, are in the mayor's office in New York, are in the mayor's office in another city, this has to be part of the conversation. It can't be a separate conversation about survivors and domestic violence and mass incarceration, criminalization, and policing. The two intersect, and intersect particularly in the practices of police officers. We have seen some great progress in legislation passed in places like New York and California that do require us to consider, once a case is in court, particularly around a violent crime, a person's past history of experiencing some kind of violence. And we need to still address the ways in which police reports, experts, as well as judges, juries, and prosecutors' perceptions, driven by that same octopus, influence enforcement of even those laws. So to give this last example, Leah Biru is an Ethiopian woman who married a serviceman who was in Ethiopia, her home country. He brought her back to the US, to rural California, where he engaged in a many years long campaign of terror against her. He would use a gun, play Russian roulette with her, etc. When he was not home, she would empty the bullets from the gun in order to try and live another day. One day the violence was happening, it escalated. She thought he was going to kill her. She grabbed the gun and, thinking there were no bullets in it, pointed it at him in an effort to get him to stop, and eventually pulled the trigger again in an effort to get him to stop. There was a bullet in the gun that he had put back in. He survived. He is alive. But she, again, police responded, looked at her, said, "You don't look like a survivor of violence who could have been acting in self-defense in this moment, even though we have this long history of calls here. We're going to arrest you for manslaughter, attempted murder, and then we're going to prosecute you." And both the judge and the prosecutor on appeal, who was Kamala Harris, all said, "We don't believe you're a survivor of violence. We don't believe the Domestic Violence Justice Act applies to you as a Black Ethiopian immigrant who has this long history of surviving this domestic violence." So we really, again, need to think about, even as the laws that we're putting in place, the remedies that we're seeking are being enacted, how they're being implemented through the lens of the octopus. So groups like, there's many resources I would point you to. Certainly Survived and Punished is one that is engaged, as many of you probably know, in survivor defense campaigns. If you are working with a survivor and would like support from community organizers to lift up the case on social media, do court watching, engage in defense work, Survived and Punished is there. There's also a toolkit they've created to help folks do that. And they also do it not just to help keep individual survivors out of jail or free them from long sentences, but to lift up some of these patterns that I'm talking about through these individual cases, so that we can start to understand how the systems that we're relying on to produce safety might actually be producing more violence and criminalization for the most vulnerable among us, and to challenge us to dream new approaches to safety that will ensure protection and from both violence and criminalization and police violence for all survivors. They have this toolkit. One of their essential organizers, Mariam Kaba, has also put out a website called transformharm.org, which offers many toolkits, offerings, frameworks about how we might respond to violence differently that would hopefully mitigate some of the harms of the criminal punishment system and criminalization of survivors. There's many other resources out there. And just in terms of resources to have these conversations with folks, obviously the book is one, but also I've created a study guide for the book that has a section on police responses to violence, as well as some tools that we can use to think of other responses to violence that would hopefully mitigate criminalization and mitigate police violence. And with that, I will stop so that we can take some time for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Wow. Thank you. Gosh, that's amazing. And I also do want to take a moment to thank our captioner.
Me too. You get the prize.
Totally. So if you have questions, you can put them into the chat box, and I will do what I can to both talk to Andrea and ask some questions, and also gather your questions at the same time. Andrea, I really appreciate that, and I've heard some of that before, and it still is just mind-boggling, some of those statistics. And so I had a couple questions here that I wanted to start with was, you were talking about those terrible statistics about the police misconduct, the sexual assaults, and targeting domestic violence survivors. Do you know if there's any departments or jurisdictions or states that are where community-based people are actually talking about that with their police departments and doing training about it? Or I don't even know what the right word is. Training doesn't quite seem to be the right word.
No, definitely not. But in the sense that training only works if there's a policy and accountability afterwards, right? Because as many of us on this group have probably done police trainings and know the blank stare, the phone looking, the head rolling, all, the not paying attention that happens during those things if they don't think the leadership takes it seriously. So in Baltimore, the Department of Justice investigation of the police department there found a significant amount of police sexual violence and also a failure to investigate and hold officers accountable, particularly with officers targeting people in the sex trade. Here in Chicago, the DOJ's investigation also addressed issues of police sexual violence, and there are a number of organizations here in Chicago, including anti-violence organizations, that are working to ensure the department adopts and effectively enforces a policy that not only works on accountability, but also prevention, detection, and support for survivors. And in New Orleans, I know people have been trying to work on that through the consent decree there, also in Puerto Rico. So there are, but there are not enough. I think that if all of us, and a group of us at, including Mariam Kaba at Barnard, recently held a meeting with the sexual assault advocates and police reform advocates from around the country about, developing a really comprehensive response to police sexual violence. And one of the things that we decided to produce is a toolkit for service providers to both document it, because it's not officially documented anywhere, and also to provide support to survivors who come forward experiencing that particular form of police violence and to engage in advocacy around it.
Wow. Is that out yet?
No, it's still in process, but it should be out this fall.
Okay. Wow, that's a really important tool, so thanks. That's great. I have heard this stat before, but it still shocks me that when you talked about 1 in 2 Black transgender women reporting experience incarceration, and one of the questions was, of 1 in 2 transgender folk jailed, do we know how many are misgendered when assigned to jails or prisons?
No, but definitely the mass majority. There are very few folks trans and gender nonconforming folks who are assigned to correctional facilities based on their gender identity. But there's no data on that. And in some ways, to be honest, I don't know that we want law enforcement or correctional officials collecting data on people's gender identity, because that creates opportunity for perhaps more violence. So that 1 in 2 number is a self-report collected by the National Center for Transgender Equality, and so we could definitely do more of our own kind of documentation, participatory research to get that information. And one of the resources I sent you at the last minute, Sue, was a Research Across the Walls, which was put out by Survived and Punished and this Interrupting Criminalization initiative at Barnard that helps people figure out how to ask those kinds of questions.
And I think that's been posted, and maybe Katita,
there it is.
Thank you, Katita, posted it again. Great. So thank you. One of the questions that just came was, what about police officers who may be known abusers but carry weapons? What is the status of any state laws regarding this, if you know?
I think there's actually a federal law. I think I know. I just read about it yesterday when I was working on a policy that says that if you have a domestic violence conviction, you're not allowed to carry a weapon. The Lautenberg Amendment is what I was reading about. I'm trying to figure out if it's Illinois or federal. But what I do know is that this causes then many police departments to underreport or miscategorize or frankly silence domestic violence reports by or complaints about domestic violence by law enforcement officers because they know that it will cause them to lose their weapon and therefore their job as a law enforcement officer. So there's a real pressure from police unions and police departments to call it something else, to not to refer people for counseling or something else so that they don't end up with a conviction that could cause them to lose their weapon and therefore their job. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, do you have any suggestions for safety planning without having police as first responders?
There are a million suggestions at transformharm.org, a website that Mariam Kaba put together, who's one of the founders of Survived and Punished, that gathers all the resources she's aware of, and she's aware of most, if not all, and created more than half of them, about transformative responses to violence or responses to violence when a person doesn't want to engage law enforcement.
Thank you. I also was taken aback again by the slide about black girls in school. And I know there's been a lot of efforts to address that, but just when if we're talking about 16% of the girls in public school are black, and then 37% of the girls arrested, 43% of girls referred to law enforcement. Do you have anything more you want to add to that, or do you have any good examples of interventions and organizing strategies that you want to hold up?
Yeah, I mean, I think black girls in schools and their allies basically are saying that police need to come out of schools. If you look at the Alliance for Educational Justice and the Advancement Project, they recently put out a report and toolkit to organize for police-free schools. There are also people in New York and in Madison, Wisconsin. The group in Madison, Wisconsin is Freedom Inc., who are particularly calling attention to police sexual harassment and sexual violence in schools as a reason to remove police from schools. So, and certainly the young women who were the subject of the assault at Spring Valley High are organizing now with a group called Every Black Girl in Columbia, South Carolina, to create conditions in schools that produce safety, not violence, for black girls, including not only getting police out of the schools, but getting rid of the laws that result in those referrals to law enforcement, even if the police officers are not stationed in the schools, the laws that administrators and teachers use to call police on girls, like disturbing the school laws, which exist in 27 states and that are disproportionately used against black girls.
27 states? Wow. So one of the things you talked about earlier in the presentation, Andrea, was you talking about the number of killings that happen when police are called to domestic violence situations. And I'm just curious, do you have data, or do you know, does it matter who calls?
I don't know. Okay. I think there's just no data about this at all. I mean, there's no data on police killings across the board. There's certainly no data often that disaggregates by race and gender, and certainly that disaggregates by context or enforcement site. I would hope all of those things would be something we could advocate for. But what I noticed just in 25 years of documenting these cases is it kind of doesn't matter who calls. That often the survivor calls and opens the door and is shot, or opens the door, has visible injuries, and is criminalized. There's also a study out of Atlanta that showed that of trans folks who were surveyed there, 67% had called the police for help and gotten arrested instead. So the survivor calls, the abuser calls, the neighbor calls, it all seems to lead to the same consequence.
And I feel like this is something that I should know, but I don't. Looking at homicides where there's a claim of self-defense, is there a breakdown on how that works out in the legal system based on race?
Yeah, I would assume that you would have that number, Sue.
Okay. I was hoping you would have it. Oh,
no. And again, there's just so little. I mean, it's funny. We started this Interrupting Criminalization initiative at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, Mariam Kaba and I, because there are so many gaps in our knowledge of how criminalization happens at the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. That we don't know as much as we need to about criminalization of men and boys, but we know even less about criminalization of women and girls, in part because of the sites it happens in, like responses to violence, and the forms it takes. And so we are really out here trying to fill that knowledge gap in partnership with many organizations and movements across the country.
Yes, and we really appreciate the work you're all doing very, very much. So. I just want to say that, thank you for calling out the trans women leaders at Stonewall. And also, I have to say, I just loved your reenactment of the police coming to the scene after Marissa Alexander shot the warning shot and how they could have responded to CeCe McDonald. And I was like, wow. You have an excellent fantasy life. But that was really something to hear,
I was an only child, so I do have an active imagination. I have brothers and sisters, but they were all out of the house by the time I was a kid. And that's the kind of imagining we need to do. That's the kind of imagination we need to have. And in fact, we need to be imagining not the cops showing up at all, but the neighbors showing up, and therefore, and doing something that would keep her and the kids safe, get dude away and into some kind of, conversation with people he feels accountable to about changing his behavior and transforming what leads him to commit that harm. And none of that involving systems that could lead Marissa to be in a cage. And that's where it's hard to imagine that, because all we've been given for so long is the police. And what we've been taught is that getting more police involvement shows success on our end, and that we are getting the state to care about us. And so many of us have been taught that the value of our lives is measured by how long someone does in a cage for harming us. And it's very difficult for us to step out of those things and step out of the octopus and out of the sea the octopus swims in and out of the web that we've woven to dream a different world. But what I've learned from Insight and from this work is we have to, if we care about survivors of violence, if we care about people who are being harmed in our homes and communities, we have to dream new ways of producing safety, because the ones we've been pursuing produce what I've been talking about for the last hour and a half.
Yeah. Just to confirm, one of the questions, another question came back about talking about alternatives to police intervention, and especially related to restorative approaches. That there are those examples and the transformharm.org website on that, right?
Pardon?
So, before, when you were talking about the alternatives to police intervention, you recommended the transformharm.org?
Yes. I feel like that
and
one...
she was actually...
They bring together a whole bunch of them. So to give to specific alternatives, there's just so many examples on there.
Okay.
That I would point people to. And I did just see this question. I know we're running out of time, but I really wanted to address it about algorithms.
About the risk assessment.
Risk assessment algorithms. So they rely on things like prior arrests or prior police contact or police records, right? So the information, even though the algorithms are supposedly objective, the information we put into them is not. And I did see a presentation at the Data for Black Lives conference at Harvard last year that showed a Black woman being assessed by an algorithm as very high risk and setting a very high bail for her, whereas an actual serial killer who was a white man was not assessed as a high risk by the algorithm and was
Wow.
recommended no bail. And the reason had to do with prior contacts with the criminal legal system and that she had prior arrests for assault that were DV connected and shoplifting that were poverty connected. And so because she had a long rap sheet, and some of them involved quote unquote violent offenses because they were DV assault, that's why she was rated higher risk, whereas the serial killer had never been caught. And so he had no prior contact with the police and had family connections, and the algorithm was like, "Oh, you're not a danger at all," even though the crimes he was charged with were quite significant. So I think that was just one example, but it's something that we really need to give us pause when we think of risk assessment tools as potentially neutral and that they won't harm survivors. That just remember the information that goes into them is based on the same patterns I'm describing here.
Yeah. And we can also include it in the list of the links that we'll put together and get out to everybody who's participated. Some work by Neil Websdale and Kathleen Ferrara out in Arizona who are also looking at risk assessment and domestic violence situations and racial bias too. So we can include that. Better Women's Justice Project recently did a webinar about it, so we can include the link to that. So Sandine and Katita, if you can help me remember that, that would be great. So Andrea, just maybe you can quickly summarize that question from Maria there about
about when
the
you call
police
for
department.
help. Yeah, saying you
Yeah.
know someone in the department. I really, it's so hard to generalize. Sometimes that can help, and sometimes it makes it worse. I know in Brescia Meadows' case, I think a family member tried to do that and it backfired. I can't say
Yep.
across the board what the answer is. I just know that, in a particular situation as a survivor, and Maria, I'm incredibly, incredibly sorry about your experience. And it's a very common one, unfortunately, among survivors of domestic violence whose partners are police officers. And I think that the most important thing we can all do as advocates is really call attention to this and to find a way to have someone else to call in that moment who's not the police, who can at least be an advocate when the police do show up. And if there's a way to get around it, but it's hard, right? Because officers are armed, and so not everyone wants to get in the middle of that. But if there's a way of working with local advocacy organizations to come up with a rapid response for when the police are not an option for whatever reason, whether it's because the abuser is a police officer, you're undocumented, or you're trans, or you're a criminalized survivor, I think that's where we all need to be, at least developing some alternatives for folks for whom law enforcement is not an option.
Absolutely. And do you see that question about finding the presentation data on the risk assessment that you were just talking about? Do you have that information that we can share with them?
It's scribbled in my notes from that presentation, but I'll try and find the people who made the presentation and send it to you.
Okay. Excellent. So we are nearing the end of our time together, and so Andrea, do you have some last words you want to share? Or this was just so valuable, and it was so chock full of information. And so, like I said, we will collect all of those different links and the resources that Andrea mentioned during the presentation, and we'll get those out to you. And Andrea, if you are able to find that additional information about that presentation, we'll add that, and anything else you think we should add. We really encourage you to look at those resources that she highlighted there. There's so many good resources that you included in this presentation, so thank you for that. So Andrea?
I guess my last sort of thoughts are, I started this work as an anti-violence advocate. I was on the board of a shelter in Toronto that served DV survivors and homeless people, homeless women. And I was asked to participate in a review of the City of Toronto's sexual assault policy, how police officers were responding to sexual assault from the perspective of domestic violence survivors and homeless women. And very quickly, people we were talking to started saying how they respond to sexual assault. You mean how they commit sexual assault? And I'm actually a survivor of sexual assault by a law enforcement officer, but I never had connected that to any of my activism, whether it was around policing or anti-violence work. It was just a bad thing that happened to me when I was young. I got out of the situation as quickly as possible and just tried to get as far away from there as possible. And I just didn't connect it to my movement work. And I think that's true of a lot of us. And it was a story that once I sort of started working on it and uncovering and documenting, really brought to both my work as an anti-violence advocate and as someone working on anti-police violence and anti-criminalization and mass incarceration work. And it has really shaped how I've understood both issues throughout my work, and definitely is also kind of the frame through which Insight really pushes us to rethink these issues. And so I want to urge folks to really expand how we think about at the intersections of interpersonal and state violence, and to recognize that these two conversations are very much connected, that interpersonal and state violence feed off each other, that they're driven by the same narratives, the same criminalizing narratives, and the same, narratives rooted in anti-blackness and colonialism, in white supremacy and in capitalism, as, everything that's driving mass incarceration, everything that's driving interpersonal violence. And for us to really put at the center of our work what will actually generate safety for the people that we work with. And while in the moment it might be calling the police, that might be the main way to generate safety, but as a structural societal response, is there something different or better that we can imagine that would increase safety not only in a moment but over the long term, and prevent violence from happening in the first place? And so I just want folks to know that, like, my journey to this work came from being an anti-violence advocate and seeing that what we were doing was not working, but actually producing more of the kinds of violence I was born to fight, and that all of us were born to fight. And so I think it's easy for us to turn away sometimes from the things that don't match with our worldview, right? I think one of the reasons we don't talk about, for instance, police sexual violence is because it's awkward when we have, worked for police to be the primary response to sexual violence, to suddenly be like, oh, wait a minute, they're doing the thing that we are promoting them as a response to. And so that just makes us sometimes literally turn away. I think I've heard anti-violence activists who have been working on sexual violence by law enforcement officers in Oklahoma City, for instance, activists who are organizing around the Daniel Holtzclaw case, called their local anti-violence organization. Their local anti-violence organization said, we can't help you because we rely on our relationship with law enforcement to work with the survivors that we work with. So we literally cannot do a public campaign around law enforcement committing violence against people, including survivors of domestic violence. And I'm really, we have to look at those hard truths. We have to be willing to have the hard conversations, including with law enforcement and other partners, and we have to be willing to fight for what actually keeps survivors safe from all forms of violence. So that's my final soapbox hope, and that we do that in the name of all the people we care about and all the survivors we fight for every day.
Oh, it's an excellent soapbox to be standing on, and the message is just perfect. So thank you. And thank you so much for just this really rich presentation and all the amazing work you've done, Andrea. And we will make the the PowerPoints are available right there. We will put the presentation, the actual webinar, up on our website, hopefully in about the next 2 weeks. As you sign out of this, you're going to get a short evaluation. If you could fill that out, we'd really appreciate that. And thanks, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for participating. You got it. Talk to you soon. Thank
Bye.
you.